My name is Maria Dalton. I will be 27 years old this year and have been happily married for 5 years. My son Martin recently celebrated his fourth birthday. At first, after I got married, I worked full-time, but now I combine part-time with working for the same company. My husband Kevin is 30 years old and 3 years older than me. Our journey from dating to marriage started with Kevin's ardent courtship, but after we got married, I noticed a more dominant side to his behavior. Kevin has a 20-year-old sister named Jane Dalton, and their age difference seems to contribute to a somewhat condescending attitude on Kevin's part. Before the marriage, I didn't mind Jane's frequent visits and assumed they got along well. However, after the marriage, I began to notice a change in her behavior. Jane would often drop by unannounced at any time and expect to be served without offering any sign of appreciation. Kevin, instead of dealing with the situation, expects me to fulfill her demands. Jane acts as if I am invisible, addressing only Kevin with a casual, "Bro, I'm here again." Despite the fact that I didn't prepare for the extra guest, I end up serving dinner to Jane. Kevin, instead of understanding, blames me out loud, insisting that I should have been more considerate. Despite Jane's verbal apology, it's obvious that she enjoys Kevin taking advantage of her preferences. Left with the leftovers, I prepare my own meal, while Kevin and Jane continue to chat on the sofa, leaving the dining table in disarray. They never acknowledge Martin or me, treating us more like hired help than family members. One evening, as I am about to take a bath with Martin, Kevin loudly interrupts me and asks me to buy a cake for Jane, even though it is late. Jane insists on getting it immediately. Kevin chides me for my procrastination, and, feeling compelled, I reluctantly head to the cake shop with Martin. Overhearing their conversation, I learn that they criticize me for my inattention and question my decision to marry me. Meanwhile, Martin, although he can't make out the words, senses the tension in our relationship. Suppressing my emotions, I ask him about his cake preference, and he happily asks for a cake with lots of fruit. Our trip to the patisserie was filled with talk of cakes, temporarily overshadowing Kevin's earlier words. Martin and I arrived just before closing time and luckily found the exact cake Jane wanted. We bought 2 cakes, including the one Martin wanted, with fruit. Back home, I served the cakes to Jane and Kevin, then prepared Martin's cake and headed into the dining room. As soon as I placed it in front of Martin, Jane pointed to it and expressed her desire for that cake. Before I could react, Kevin, ignoring Martin's protests, moved the cake Martin had chosen in front of Jane. Kevin justified his action by claiming that he had bought the cake with his own money and had the right to choose for Martin. Unable to contain my emotions any longer, I voiced my displeasure. In response, Kevin threatened divorce. Martin, having stopped crying, worriedly took my hand, and then, after a little thought, said, "Mom, I like strawberry cake too. Yes, it's very tasty." He said this while eating the cake that Jane had originally wanted to eat. Feeling that Martin was tolerating too much, I picked up his plate of cake when I saw Jane reaching for it. I took Martin into the next room so he could enjoy the cake in peace. Kevin apologized to Jane, saying he was sorry for his stinginess. Despite wanting to respond, I held back for Martin's sake. Watching Martin innocently enjoying his cake was very touching. After finishing the cake, we decided to take a late bath and fall asleep in Martin's bed. The next morning, I discovered that Jane had already left. As I was preparing breakfast, I heard Martin crying in shock. His piggy bank, a gift from my father, had been broken and the money he had saved was gone. Martin, who always wished the piggy bank a good night, was heartbroken. When I asked Kevin about it, he mentioned in passing that Jane needed the money and took it from the piggy bank. Holding a crying and shaking Martin in my arms, I felt his pain so keenly that I cried with him. It was painful to watch Kevin prioritize and care for his sister more than our son. After expressing my anger and sadness, I got into an argument with Kevin, breaking my usual silence and arguments in front of Martin. Without a word, Kevin went into the bedroom and returned with something shocking in his hands: divorce papers. In a fit of anger, he lashed out at me, shook the papers out, and ran out of the house with a loud bang. Martin, who had never cried over the problems with Kevin and Jane, seemed to have reached his breaking point, crying since last night. Unable to bear to see Martin in so much pain, I suggested we skip a day at nursery, and he happily agreed, saying yes loudly and smiling weakly. We spent the day playing and chatting with Martin, who brought a picture book from the shelf, sat on my lap, and happily remarked, "The nursery teacher today was Mummy, wasn't she? He looks like an angel." His little heart seemed overflowing with patience, and I decided to make the day special by taking the day off work. Despite the potential trouble at work, they were sympathetic to the situation and gave me the day off. In the morning, we visited the park, played hide and seek, had fun in the sandpit and on the slide. When we got home for lunch, Martin looked sleepy. Normally, he would doze off on his own, but today he fell asleep on my lap, just like when he was a baby. Although at first I thought about doing chores while he slept, I decided today was a special day. Instead, I allowed myself to heal by looking at his peaceful sleeping face and gentle breathing. However, my serene state was abruptly interrupted by a noise coming from the entryway. The front door opened. Since Kevin didn't usually come home, I was suspicious, and I quickly hid in the bedroom wardrobe, cradling Martin in my arms. A voice came through the house, and to my surprise, it was Jane, trembling with fear. I listened as she searched for something, expressing frustration at not being able to find it. Jane then made a phone call, mentioning Kevin and discussing their unsuccessful search. After hearing her close the front door and leave, I put Martin to bed and thought about the strange events. I couldn't understand why Jane had entered the house or what they were looking for. Suddenly, Kevin seemed alien to me, and I felt a mixture of disgust and fear for him. After quickly packing for Martin and myself, we went to the train station and took the train to my parents' house. Fortunately, their house was nearby, only 2 stations away. Although I hadn't contacted them beforehand, my parents sensed something in my facial expression and welcomed us without any further questions. I told them everything that had happened, including that I was afraid to stay in our house because of Kevin and Jane's actions. Hearing my mother's suggestion that Jane might have been looking for my belongings, possibly money cards, I recalled my past experience as a successful executive in the handmade goods industry. I had entrusted the company to friends when, after marriage, I decided to prioritize raising a child. Although I still worked part-time and communicated with the company from home, Kevin was unaware that I was still the CEO. I deliberately withheld details about being a CEO and my savings, realizing early on in our marriage that Kevin struggled with money management and tended to spend everything he earned. At first, Kevin only budgeted $2,000 a month for food, and even suggested that I quit my job to become a full-time homemaker. However, with the financial strain of raising Martin and only $200 for food, I did not agree to become a full-time housewife. Eventually, he reluctantly allowed me to work part-time, and to keep me from thinking about divorce, he made me sign a post-marriage property disclaimer through an attorney. From the time Martin was born, I used my savings to pay for his nursery and clothes. Since I only received $200 for food, I never asked Kevin for additional funds beyond the food budget, which led him to believe I had savings. Given Jane's obvious need for money, and Kevin's perception of my financial situation, they may be looking for my money cards. I have a separate savings account designated for Martin, into which a portion of my salary is directly deposited each month. Despite the search, they will not find the money cards as I always carry valuables with me. However, another troubling question remains. Jane can sneak into our house even when we are not there, and Kevin may be allowing her to do so. On my father's advice, I decided to keep valuables, including money cards, in my parents' safe. While I was contemplating the fact that they needed money, Martin approached my father, crying about his broken piggy bank and broken promise to save up. My dad, angered by Martin's story, vowed to call Kevin. My mother suggested we quietly figure out their purpose, as Kevin's mention of the divorce could shift the blame to us and make the divorce more favorable to him. To find out their purpose, I decided to record their conversation. After consulting with a lawyer who was a friend of my father's, I started cooking dinner when I got home, holding my phone screen down to keep a secret record. Kevin arrived home, surprising me by immediately asking about my money cards. He answered my questions vaguely, trying to trick me. When I stopped talking, Kevin became agitated and demanded all of my money that I was spending on a part-time job for his sister. Refusing, I explained that it was for Martin's savings. In response, he angrily pushed the signed divorce papers towards me, stating that I was living on his money and shouldn't be saving for Martin. He even uttered words implying that he cared more about Jane than our son. Hearing this, I stopped cooking, put the divorce papers in my bag, took Martin's hand, and headed for the door. Kevin announced in a loud voice that he was serious about the divorce and told me never to come back. I responded by stating that I would not return to a house where a stranger was free to come and go. After leaving, I received numerous texts and calls from Kevin, which I ignored by switching off my phone. I found refuge in my parents' home, sharing the record and divorce papers with them. Although I admitted that I had no love or affection for Kevin, I expressed concern for Martin. My parents advised me to do what I wanted, recognizing that divorce could have an emotional impact on Martin. As I pondered my decision to divorce Kevin, Martin expressed his hunger. My mother, seeing my distress, kindly cooked hamburgers, his favorite meal. Tears came to my eyes as Mum, with a warm smile, told Martin that she had cooked the burgers so that he and I could visit whenever we wanted. After taking a bite, Martin exclaimed with joy, praised Grandma's hamburgers, and expressed his desire to eat them every day. I replied that this was because the hamburger contained the love I felt for him, and he took a big bite and handed it to me in a touching gesture. Impressed by Martin's kindness, I could not hold back my tears, and although I tried to stop them, they did not stop. My father, noticing Martin's concern, assured him that my tears were from happiness, not sadness. Hearing this, Martin hugged me in a moment of understanding, and my father's eyes turned bright red. Realizing how blessed I was to be with my family, I remarked to Martin that family was very precious. Surprised, he asked if Dad had said that only Jane was family. Dad gently confirmed this, but then asked Martin if he wanted to live with them as a family. With a laugh, Martin happily agreed, making everyone smile. Naturally, despite thoughts of divorce, the feast was so happy that I finally decided to break up with Kevin. I planned to let Martin know, and although discussing it tugged at my heartstrings, Martin seemed to understand the situation. Thankfully, he expressed his desire to live as a family, cuddled the pet dog, and called him his little brother, even though the dog was older. Preparations for the divorce began by contacting a lawyer who was a friend of my father's. The next day we drew up the agreement, and my father and Martin shared a comforting laugh as I lay in bed reminiscing about my childhood. The next day, checking my smartphone, I found over 200 calls and texts from Kevin, indicative of his emotional instability. Exhausted, I switched off my phone, and with the help of a lawyer, we explained the situation to my parents. Jane had accumulated significant debt due to her addiction to casinos and shopping, and Kevin was acting as her guarantor, planning to use my savings. The lawyer confirmed that divorce papers had been filed, and Kevin burst into tears as he realized the matter was already settled. Despite the expected disagreement over alimony, he signed a commitment to pay Martina $340 monthly. In Kevin's follow-up call, there was no aggression in his tone. He calmly admitted to the financial manipulation and explained his complicated feelings for Jane. I firmly stated my decision not to reconsider and heard his faint sobs, after which he wished me happiness and hung up. Staying strong to the end, I discussed future plans with my parents and decided to stay with them until Martin grew up. I returned to my duties as president of the company and later learned that Kevin and Jane had informed their parents of their divorce and debt, resulting in their abandonment. Today, I find happiness with my family,